Please welcome CEO of, wait, what? The company that brings you masters of scale, Jeff Berman.
Carol, before we bring our guests out, we want to do a little show and tell. Give you a little bit of video, a little view. If you're not paying attention to what's happening more on the consumer side of AI, give you a sense. As of about 7 weeks ago, if I'd shown you some AI videos, you would have seen like 6 fingers on one hand, 3 eyes, hair growing out of the side of the arm. It would have been messy, right? And then 6 weeks ago, OpenAI's Sora initiative released a set of videos, including the one that Mandy's about to roll right now, which was created with this 2-sentence prompt. And it's stunning, and it's realistic. And you can all of a sudden start to see what AI video is going to look like. And just a few days ago, Sora released its first short film, and it's short enough that I'm going to show you the whole thing because based on the chats last night, not everyone has seen it. So, Mandy, if we can play that film real quick, that'd be great. Thank you.
Well, they say everyone has something unique about them, something that sets them apart. It's just in my case, it's quite obvious what that thing is. I am literally filled with hot air. Yeah, living like this has its challenges. Windy days, for one, are particularly troublesome. Or there was the one time my girlfriend insisted I go to the cactus store to get my Uncle Jerry a wedding present. Ugh. What do I love most about my predicament? The perspective it gives me. I get to see the world differently. I float above the mundane and the ordinary. I see things a different way from everyone else. Yeah, and I feel like it's because of that perspective I'm reminded every day that life is fragile. We're all just a pinprick away from deflation. So I try to live life with a lightness, a buoyancy, a joie de vivre. I got a lot of ideas keeping this thing full. With any luck, I'll find a way to share them with everyone else.
Wow. Okay, so rather than hear me talk about it, we're going to bring our guests out. We're going to bring Lama Nachman from Intel and Alex Wang from ScaleAI out onto stage. Keep going. Yeah, there we go. Hello. Nice to see you. Alex, nice to see you. We just showed some of the Sora videos that OpenAI has distributed. We'll link to those in the show notes of this on YouTube and your various podcast platforms. In Hollywood, this was a bit of a, oh my God, I'm freaking out, holy shit moment. Tyler Perry stopped work on an $800 million studio build-out. Jeffrey Katzenberg said that 90% of animation jobs are likely to be gone in Hollywood in the next few years. And so I'm curious about your perspective on this. Is this the end of Hollywood?
So that's an interesting question. I actually somewhat see it an enablement of
Great. Tell us why
where
it's an
the world
enablement.
would go.
Let us know why.
So, if you think about it, consistently what we have seen, right, as more capabilities have come up, is much more interesting innovation that actually came out. So, and it's really, it's a choice that we make, right? Because every time there is an interesting technology that has the ability to automate, you can go the path of automation, or you can go and figure out how do you design human AI systems that can actually get you the essence of what human creativity is, and in some sense, it's like the complementarity between AI and humans, and bring something that's much more compelling to the table. Of course, that will only happen if we design systems with that in mind. So it could go that way. My optimistic side thinks about this as being, how do we think about what people need to bring their creativity to the table with tools that are built from the get-go to try to actually enable that creativity to happen. The other side of it as well is that you're actually democratizing, right, a lot of these technologies. So now you're enabling, a much wider spectrum of people to bring their creativity to the table. So,
and I love that optimism, and I feel that, and yet, Alex, when Jeffrey Katzenberg, who ran DreamWorks Animation, who's one of the most important people in the history of Hollywood animation, says that we're going to see 90% job displacement in a category, it's going to take a while. If he's right, it's going to take a while for the market to catch up. So are you as optimistic about this, or do you feel like we're entering kind of this interregnum where the old king is dead, but the new king is not yet born?
It is something like an interregnum. That being said, I mean, I think that if you take a step back, it's a huge boon for storytellers. I think that the short story or the short film that you played, that would have been a nearly impossible thing to have conjure up onto a screen prior to that. So I think that the question for us isn't like, if we looked at the stories or the movies or the short films that are being done today, how efficiently could this be done in the future? The answer is significantly more efficiently. But what does that enable in terms of storytelling for the future? I think it's a huge unlock for what film could be or what films can be. And I think one way to think about this is like a lot of films now have tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollar visual effects budgets. It's true they won't have to spend that much on visual effects going forward. It'll be able to be done much more automatically using these models, but what does that mean in terms of like how imaginative or how strange of films can we have in the future? And I think that the key here is, I mean, the industry itself will evolve, and Hollywood has evolved many times up until now. The original advent of animation and, advanced 3D animation as Pixar sort of introduced originally was like this, this huge change. There were these kinds of movies that you could create that you could have never made before that were somehow significantly more relatable to children and much more meaningful to children, and created sort of a new canvas by which content could be created. So I think I really think about it as an evolution in that vein, which is we're continuing to create more engaging, imaginative, and powerful platforms for creative content, and Hollywood as a business is going to have to get on board with that.
There's been some hysteria about job displacement, maybe less than what we would have expected because we haven't seen it actually happen yet. The massive jobs report just this week, in the past week. Do you think job displacement is coming in a meaningful way before these kind of new industries are created, new jobs are created?
So I think what we see, we at Scale have an incredible benefit of being able to, we help lots of enterprises and government customers implement AI to actually realize clear business value. And I think that the pattern that we see over and over again is something like this. There's a very talented group a very talented team or group of people within the company, whether it be engineers and coders or lawyers or consultants or some very high-end group of individuals within the company who maybe 20% of their job requires very high ingenuity and capability and sort of all of their training and all of their brilliance, but 60% of the job is just relatively rote or is something that fundamentally does not actually require all of their training and brilliance and capabilities. And the pattern we see over and over again is how do you build co-pilots that are able to help them do the 60% of other work and then maximize their time so they can spend most of it doing the stuff that actually requires their ingenuity and their capability. And that's kind of what we've seen with coding, where what the coding assistants and co-pilots do is they help you, not do all the boilerplate code or all the simple fixes, or helps you catch bugs more easily, stuff like that. Or the legal assistants help you just draft the entire document, but like all the sort of like important legal decision making is still left to the lawyer. These are, I think, this is like the pattern of the future, which I think is a pretty optimistic one because this does not in itself result in labor displacement, because most of these jobs that we're talking about are, there's a shortage of them in the economy. Most of these high-end fields, we need more doctors, we need more engineers, we need more of them in the world. And I think this goes towards what I see as the longer-term trend, frankly, which is, I think that the AI systems are moving towards being superhuman in some ways, but meaningfully subhuman in others. So I think, already GPT-4 is a much better writer than I am, just in terms of, not making grammar mistakes and being able to structure very flowing prose and, being able to write very beautifully. But it's much worse than me at reasoning. It's much worse than me at thinking in sort of like very long forms. It's much worse than me at getting factuality correct. It's much worse than me in some other ways. And so the direction of the future is going to be these hybrids between human capability and some superhuman AI capabilities to achieve better outcomes.
Okay, so Lama, I hear Alex, and I want to be all in with Alex on this, and yet I have a friend who runs a small law firm, and because of the productivity gains they've been able to make using AI, taking out that 40 to 60% more rote work, they've been able to reduce the number of paralegals they need. Right? Yeah. It's logical. So that efficiency game, the ability to focus on higher level work makes a ton of sense. And thinking of AI as a co-pilot, right? Microsoft did a great job branding their product there, makes a ton of sense. But logically, why shouldn't companies then say, well, we can reduce costs by 40% at the same time?
Yeah, and they can, and that will happen. The question is this creating an economy where the demand of all the new things that can happen will end up, resulting in an overall, more acquisition and more opportunities for jobs. There's no question that there will be a lot of jobs also that will be displaced, right? So making us more efficient will mean less of us will be required for that same amount of work. But the assumption here is that it is that same amount of work. What will happen, right? But if you think about just scaling across the world of what is possible, where the potential is, right? Movies that can be made, all of that is really starting from this notion that it's a zero-sum game. I think that's actually kind of the missing piece of that puzzle, right? Because I think we're in such a generative world where opportunity and new things that we haven't even dreamt of doing will be made. And that will impact certain jobs that we're limited or unneeded in a certain way. But that means, right, it's an opportunity as well to continue to innovate, and differently from previous innovation. The reason I'm actually optimistic is that if we build AI systems in ways that can support and amplify human capability, then in some sense it's like, yeah, and that capability is helping the human continue to evolve. So in some sense, it's like, yeah, it's taking something away, but it's also enabling you to be supported in these, co-pilots and all of these capabilities that would make acquisition of new skill also easier for people.
And do you think there will be that gap? Do you think that we'll see massive job loss over the next few years before new jobs come up, or are you more optimistic
I think there will be. It's really hard to guess whether, the ability to transition to different types of jobs, being enabled with these AI capabilities, if that's going to help people bridge that gap or not. That's in some sense, like if being an optimist, I see this as a place where we can train people very quickly with new types of skills because of the fact that AI can actually be a support system. But, I would be shocked if there was no dip in some certain areas and fields, for sure.
Alex, do you agree?
I think it's certainly a possibility, and I think that the key, I think, for us as a society is that this is potentially a really big deal. So, if you take kind of a political lens, so if you looked at the, probably the most comparable thing in recent time was the outsourcing of American automotive manufacturing. So, we used to have all this domestic automotive manufacturing, then it sort of slowly got outsourced to outside the United States. Over a few decade time period, it resulted in displacement of roughly 10 to 15% of American jobs over that time period. And that was over multiple decades, and this became, I think, one of the politically most important issues of our time, was sort of the hollowing out of the American industrial base and sort of all of the implications of that. I think if you look at the potential of what might happen with artificial intelligence or generative AI over the next, not even few decades, but just 5 years really, in terms of what is the potential displacement, it's potentially large, which is one of the reasons why I think it's important that this technology is not, AI fundamentally should not just be a cost cutter. It should be an innovation tool. It should be a tool that creates new business models. It should be a tool that creates a lot of economic growth. It should be something that really spurs a huge amount of new products, new business models, new direction, and new capabilities outside of just kind of this displacement of human labor.
We have just so much uncertainty in the world today, and this feels like it's yet another layer of it. I'm curious, Alex, you dropped out of MIT, right? College dropout made good. Lama and I were talking before we came on stage. We both have 17-year-olds who are anticipating going on to college in a year and change. What are the skills that you think young people need to develop today for the economy that's coming?
Yeah, well, first, I actually think prompt engineering is a very important skill. The knowing how to interface with AI systems is an incredibly critical capability that I think is very akin to software engineering over the past few decades. So I think prompt engineering is very important. But I think much more so than that, the thing that if you take a big step back, what are these algorithms really good at? They're good at things that are present in their data set. And one thing that is not, and most of them are trained off of, more or less the entirety of the internet. One thing that's not present on basically any of the internet or very sparse in all of the data that these models are trained on is very consistent and thoughtful long-form thinking. So
say more. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so it's very, you don't see in any of these data sets, and this is one of the reasons why the model struggled with this so much, very long chains of thought. By that I mean sort of let's say you're given a very tough problem at work or in school, and it takes you have to try one thing and it doesn't work, and you have to try another thing and it doesn't work, and it takes maybe 30 or 40 steps to really work through it. And I think for most of us in our jobs, most of the hard things that we do are akin to this. If you have to organize a very complex project, there's a lot of trial and error that goes into it. There's a lot of chain of thought. There's a lot of readjusting to unique things. Oftentimes in the field, we call this agentic behavior or agent behavior. So how can the model actually be able to deal with new information and make choices and kind of think through many, many steps? One thing you'll notice is the models today are pretty bad at this. They're very bad at thinking multiple steps. They usually make a mistake on the third or fourth or fifth sort of what's called a reasoning step or chain of thought. And so the thing that's really important, and I think this is something that humans will always be differentiated in, because if you think about human evolution, we were evolved to survive, and oftentimes that survival involved being able to survive over decades and decades of time. So we're very good at long-form reasoning and very good at thinking over very long time horizons. Models are not good at that fundamentally. They're very good at predicting the next token. They're not good at thinking over a very long over a long time period. So the areas where humans will always have a meaningful sort of reasoning or intelligence advantage relative to models is long form thought, long duration thought, thinking over long time horizons. And these are the things to really dig deep on. What does that mean in terms of skills? I think it's it's classic stuff. It's doing math, doing physics, doing all these sort of technical fields is very important. I think there's a lot of fields like economics, which force you to think very long term and think through the implications many steps down that are very valuable. But that kind of thinking, I think, is what is durable.
Lama, I again want to be with Alex on this, and yet I look at the evolution just of AI video, for example, over the last 7 weeks, and we're 2 or 3 years ahead of where I thought we'd be in the pace. It's like Moore's law on amphetamines. It's unbelievable. Do you agree that the model's going to take a long time to get there on the long form, or is this actually just one breakthrough away?
It's interesting, tomorrow? Right? Because on one hand, if you think about coming up with outputs based on inputs is what has been observed, right, by all of these models. What you don't have, ample data about is the type of thinking and processes that have gone in to generate that. However, just to be thinking in a different way. I mean, we're kind of making the assumption that the representation that these models need to understand need to follow the process of human thinking. And I guess there's a question to be asked, which is, would it have understood things very differently to come up with these type of outcomes? So, Can
you give an example of what you mean there?
I mean, I'm just saying, like, for example, you could assume that if I narrated every thought that I had as I was trying to come up from a problem to a solution, then you can train an AI system with all of these things, and these things are not like people don't narrate every single thought that goes through their head, right? So then, one possibility is to say, well, it's going to be very hard for AI to try to actually come up with such a reasoning. But that assumes that that reasoning needs to be consistent with human reasoning. So if I think about, for example, AI being used to, design furniture, right? The way that it would come, the things that it would come up with and the things that will, get generated has nothing to do with the assumptions of how we build these things, right? We think of things in a very structured way, differently in how it actually evolves that way. So is there a similar thing around human reasoning that really there is enough input and output in the world that the AI systems will actually figure out how do you go from point A to point B without necessarily following like the internal state of what a human would have actually progressed through that.
So you think we may end up, what Alex thinks is much further away, you think maybe much closer.
I mean, I think today there is no question that that's where AI struggles. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
If I want to just kind of go outside of the box and say, does that assumption hold? I don't know if that assumption will hold into the future. For sure it holds today. And that's, I think, a big part of what, the human capability is about. Going back, though, to what you were talking about, with what is that skill that, I ask myself this all the time because I do have a 17-year-old, right? And it's and a lot of people come to me and it's oh, what do you think people should study? I'm like, okay, the one thing that I would say is really critical, right? And people really need to be thinking about this, is really critical thinking and reasoning, right? So that is something, especially given the fact that you can't even trust what an AI system will even generate, right? So you need to have critical thinking to actually reason about outputs of things that you don't necessarily even know whether it's right or wrong, right? Today, that's part of my concern around a lot of the state of where AI systems are today, right? Even though we think about it as an equalizer and it improves equity and democratization, all of that, in reality, people who are experts can take what they want out of it and know what to ignore. And it's really people who don't have that capacity are probably more vulnerable to the mistakes that these systems actually make. So, I would honestly, critical thinking, I think, continues to be the thing that I think
and this is where what you and Alex are saying dovetails really nicely because prompt engineering and critical thinking and reasoning actually go very much hand in hand. I want to just give a quick personal example and segue into really personal AI. About 7 weeks ago, my 14-year-old and I were having lunch and we were planning a spring break ski trip. And we went on ChatGPT and we asked it to compare this year's weather data using Bing to the past 10 years of weather and snowpack data. We included a few other variables to avoid altitude sickness, ease of travel, et cetera. It sped out a suggestion. Great, ended up being a terrific trip. We got 40 inches of snow the week we were there. Probabilities, obviously, but they worked in our favor. What I'm imagining is the next step, which is the integration with my calendar, the integration with my purchase history, my credit card, my bank account, et cetera, my Airbnb rentals or my hotel stays, and the leap from asking that one question through that one prompt to surfacing flights, car rental, Airbnb, hotel, restaurant reservations, et cetera, feels quite short. Alex, how close to that do you think we are?
I think there's two pieces here. First, I think that just the consumer behavior of, I kind of call it autopilot everything, but imagine, for those of you who have seen or used Tesla Autopilot, full self-driving, you sort of press a button and then it just kind of drives for you. You observe it. Every once in a while, it tells you to like wiggle the steering wheel, but it just drives for you, and you kind of watch it, and it works great. I think that autopilot for everything, autopilot for commerce or autopilot for travel, or these things is really the direction of the future, and I think it'll be a very natural. Initially it'll feel weird, but I think it'll be a very natural kind of consumer behavior for a lot of people to step into. So I definitely agree that this is kind of the future. What's needed to get there is a huge reliability boost in the models, massive reliability boost. Right now, the reason no products like that, there's plenty of products like that exist, they all suck because the models are nowhere close to reliable enough where you can actually depend on it to do any of those activities. And even if it has, let's say even a model has like 90% reliability, which in machine learning for these models would be like incredibly high. If for a user, 1 in every 10 times it like creates a wrong charge on your credit card or books the wrong thing or books the wrong flight, that's extremely frustrating and you're just not going to use the product. So it has to get to almost like 99.9% reliability.
For full automation, yes. But to surface the recommendations based on my past history and how I've rated things or what have you, are we really that far from that?
Oh, just pure recommendations. I think that more like what I'll call like L2 level autonomy. So like just.
What do you mean by L2? What's
that?
Yeah.
So so we used to work a lot in autonomous vehicles, self-driving, and there was this ladder of different levels of autonomy. In Phoenix here, actually, Waymo has L4 autonomy, which is you get in, there's no driver, it drives for you. That's like pretty magical. L2 autonomy is like, you're watching it very actively, and you can only self-drive in certain areas or certain contexts or locales. So for the commerce setting, it's like, hey, it's asking you before it does things, and it gives you recommendations and all that stuff. That's already basically here. So I'm on the board of Expedia. Expedia has launched a generative AI travel assistant. Plenty of customers use it. They find it very, very helpful and useful. As part of that, Expedia built models that were sort of fine-tuned and customized to be really good at these travel workflows and sort of these like travel agent-like questions and answers. And so I think that's more or less here. And I think the key unlock is actually the consumer experience on how to make that really natural and easy and flow into all the other behaviors. What I'm excited about, and I think is actually closer than we'd think, is the next unlock that we're talking about, where it's like actually autopilot, true autopilot for everything. And that reliability boost in the models, I think, could come here faster than we expect.
And with that, Lama, come massive privacy considerations. Or how worried are you about these companies having this level of access to our data?
Yeah, that's quite concerning. Let me just go back to one thing before we go to privacy. Yeah. I think there's a question about what type of an interaction and engagement one wants, right? So I love the example of autopilot. And when you think about autopilot, I was kind of actually trying to think about this the other day. So I have a Tesla, and I've tried self-driving, and it drove me crazy.
Why?
Right? And it drove me crazy, and I was thinking about this as like, I use, self-driving rideshare and, Waymo in San Francisco all the time. I don't have a problem with that. But I'm sitting in the back seat. I'm assuming that what I want is to go from point A to point B. I don't read, other than the time, if it took me there much longer, I would have a problem. But other than that, I'm not trying to control its behavior, right? That's all I want. If I'm sitting behind, the steering wheel, that's not my natural interaction, right? I am wanting to control that experience. I am wanting it not to change lanes when I don't want it. Like, why are you changing lanes? That makes no sense. Because I'm trying to map it into my own control level and thinking of what I want done, right? So it's really a big part of whether, that we're ready for what experience has a lot to do with what type of interaction we're actually enabling with these systems.
Right, it's context dependent.
Exactly, yeah. It's very context dependent. So when you then ask the question, what is actually possible in what period of time? To me, what's interesting always is, in any proactive system, just kind of think back to before any of the Gen AI stuff, right? I would say one of probably the most transformative things in the past that we've passed through was actually location awareness, right? And the reason location awareness was phenomenal is that you went from having to enter this information to something that ubiquitously can observe, right? Understand patterns, make recommendations that make sense, and make it totally effortless, right? So it will tell you, it's proactive, but it's contextually aware. So it's empowered by that context to be proactive, as opposed to something that's constantly like coming at you. It's like, why, just get away, right? So to me, what's really interesting about that question is, what is the content that is needed to enable that type of an experience? And is that something that happens by observing my behaviors, right? Is it by looking at, where do you draw that line, right? Because you can go and ask the user a set of questions, right? And it can bring all sorts of data to that and then make inferences. And the question is like, at what point do you want to bring the user in to make that an experience that is automating a lot of the annoying things, but not taking away the level of control that I want out of that experience? So I am like, and that's not just about AI, right? That's like people, for example, how they interact with their assistants, with their like people assistants, right? Like some people would say, okay, I don't care, just book me something, right? I want to control every flight that I'm getting on because I have all of these other things that I want to do.
Right. I'm hearing two different things, right? One is humans are notoriously bad self-reporters, right? We're really bad
100%.
witnesses even about
100%.
ourselves. And so we say we want this, but really we kind of want that much of the time, right? So there's a version where we say, I'm headed to Phoenix for the Intel Vision Summit and I'm looking for flights in this time frame and whatever. And okay, great. There's also a version where it's got access to my calendar, it's got access to my email, it's got access to my flight history, and it's able to say, Jeff, it looks like you need to go to Phoenix for the Intel Vision Summit. Based on your past history, here are the 3 flights I'm recommending for you, right?
Yeah.
Those are two
those are very different things. And I want to go on this vacation. I want to make sure that I pass by this because I heard, so that it's really that level of interaction of back and forth, right? Where it's not looking like I'm searching on all of these million things, but I'm really giving the things that I care about.
Well, in a way, it's then refining
exactly.
what it is. And so
which takes us back to prompt engineering.
I'm going to push into the privacy question here because this kind of AI personal utopia state of it inferring with 99 point several nines accuracy what I'm likely to want sounds beautiful. But like, should we be scared about the privacy components?
We should absolutely be scared.
I actually, one of the reasons why, so I agree, the privacy stuff is very concerning, and there's a lot of, very weird outcomes there that I think we probably are not super happy with as a society. In fact, we've kind of, we have a whole body of sci-fi. Black Mirror, in a nutshell, is basically what goes wrong when you have hyper-powerful technology and privacy gone awry. This is one of the reasons why for the current brand of AI technology, I'm actually much more focused on the B2B and the enterprise applications of the technology, much more so than the consumer applications. Because I think in the consumer applications, we have to reckon with, multiple decades of relatively lax perspective in the technology industry on privacy. And now we sort of have, broadly speaking, we're at a reckoning with that, and we have to reconcile that with this incredibly powerful new technology, which on the one hand, yes, seems like it could be, very helpful and beneficial, but on the other hand, are we continuing down a slippery slope? I think in the B2B context or the enterprise context, you don't have a lot of those privacy concerns, but you still have the ability, you have the potential for huge amounts of economic opportunity and economic gains and economic progress and innovation, and we can all of a sudden create just a dramatically better experience in all sorts of different ways that actually has nothing to do with, I think, a lot of the thorny data privacy issues that relate to a lot of the consumer tech companies.
I hear you, and yet I want to focus in on this privacy question for a minute, and maybe I can frame it in part this way, Lama, for you to dive in on this. AI right now, there are a handful of very big companies that are way out in front, that are incredibly well funded, that dominate the engineering talent. I want personally a robust ecosystem of early stage startups because I want one that's going to use a Google API, for example, to access my calendar, my email, et cetera, where I'll pay a premium for privacy protection. given what we've seen in social media, given what we saw in Web 1.0 and the evolution of commerce, and then balancing that with what we've seen with GDPR in particular and a rise of privacy protection, where do you see this going, and where should it go on the privacy front?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there are a couple of different angles to the discussion on privacy. One is, clearly the privacy issue has been around for quite some time, even before Gen AI, right? I think clearly the need for massive amount of data to train these systems has made the problem much worse, right? That, in some sense, is a little bit different than does it know everything about me so that it can hyper-personalize, right? So I think, whether you're talking about a consumer or, any other type of application, the reality is these systems are being trained on our data to be able to actually get to that level of intelligence, right? Irrespective of whether it's actually personalizing to our needs. So I think that can only be solved by regulation, right? Because
you don't think a robust open marketplace will solve that problem. It's going to require government intervention.
Well, I think there is, given the fact that there is some sort of government, not necessarily from what laws are allowed, but what transparency laws are needed, right? Because yes, an open market is something that will bring privacy as a value proposition, and people can always give up whatever they don't care about, and that's true. But the question is, how do we know, how do we trust that these things are actually adhering to the privacy, values that they're actually bringing up? So that's what I meant by there needs to be regulation in terms of transparency, audits, all of these things to ensure that actually the privacy constraints that people are claiming are actually true, right? I think it should absolutely be up to people. I mean, it's your data. You should be able to say, I want to give it up or not give it up, and that's completely up to you. The question, though, is, I think this notion that from a technology standpoint, it absolutely needs to be done in a certain way to be privacy preserving or not. I don't think that that's actually true. I think the reason people have not taken care of privacy in that way is because they need that data, right? It's not because it's impossible to make these systems private. So to me, what's interesting about this whole notion of hyper-personalization, for example, that you mentioned, right? Can I actually have an agent that will do exactly what I want, right? You can build systems that can do that and not have your data being taken away and used to train other systems, right? You could do all of these things locally. You could do these things with you. You can keep them with you. That's not something that technology cannot enable. But today, the reason it's not happening is because that's not advancing the state of AI more generally.
Alex, I spent 4 years early in my career as chief counsel to a member of the Senate leadership, which I feel makes me especially well qualified to say how spectacularly unqualified Washington is to regulate AI at this stage. You're spending a lot of time in DC. What are you seeing from Capitol Hill and the administration, and are you bullish on the path toward regulation, or are you bearish?
Yeah, so first of all, I think that what we've seen over the past year and a bit, basically ever since the launch of ChatGPT, has been an incredible amount of engagement from all of DC, I would say, Capitol Hill, from folks in the White House, from folks across many of the departments, in really understanding the technology, first and foremost, understand what's coming with the technology, understanding what the risks are, and what risks do we need to be very concerned about, such as deepfakes, or such as biorisk was a big topic that we talked was talked a lot about in DC, or what are all of the various risk factors that this technology holds, as well as what are the opportunities with the technology. And even just last week, the Speaker of the House came by Silicon Valley, came by San Francisco, and held a roundtable with a number of AI entrepreneurs to really understand, okay, what do I need to know about this technology as we look towards the next phase of looking at this incredible revolution? And I would say the area that I personally see a lot of momentum around, and it's very exciting to me, is and it relates to the privacy point as well, is we're all around testing and evaluating these AI systems. So, there are going to be these great AI systems that are built and developed, and we want to encourage as much innovation as possible in America particularly, but globally as well, to encourage economic prosperity. But how are we going to ensure that all of these models are properly safe, are privacy preserving, and meet all the criteria that we think we need to ensure as a society? And this is kind of the direction that we've seen some of the major governments going. The UK has an AI Safety Institute, the US has an AI Safety Institute. It looks like Japan and Korea are going to add AI Safety Institutes, all in the mission of ensuring that there's proper test and evaluation of these AI systems. And I think this is one of the areas that I think we can all agree, if we're going to build, if the US, if in the United States, we're going to have private enterprises investing, tens of billions, potentially hundreds of billions of dollars in the future to build very powerful AI systems, we need the proper guardrails and safeguards in place to ensure that these technologies serve the needs of humanity and don't have major risks associated with them.
And the risks are massive. I mean, we got social media spectacularly wrong, right? I mean, every bit of data says so. And yet, if we regulate badly or over-regulate early, we're going to stifle competition. We're going to fall behind the rest of the world. Like, we can't have that. We know that industry is awful at self-regulation historically. And here we are sitting here in April 2024 with arguably the most consequential presidential election since the Civil War, just barely over 6 months away. So I guess I'm looking for more. I'm looking for here's the fear I have, right, is we've already seen deepfakes. We've already seen a deepfake robocall of President Biden in New Hampshire. We saw on stage earlier today images that were obviously faked of President Biden and President Trump together. And it feels like the consumer platforms are at best going to be a half step behind, right? Because those who are committing AI social warfare are almost inevitably going to be a step ahead. What do we do about that? Is that where government has to step in? Can companies effectively, do they have to spend billions of dollars right now to protect us? What do we do?
So that's a really interesting question. And I think the problem with thinking about risk in AI is that there are very different risks. And the solutions for these different risks are very different, right? So, if you think about the unintended consequences, right? Maybe like one simple way of thinking about it is thinking about people who are actually trying to do the right thing, but these systems are so complex that it's very hard to control. It's very hard to, know how to actually make them safe. Then there is the other bucket, which is, people who actually want to blow up the world, and they're actually, utilizing AI in ways, these are like the catastrophic events, the terrorist threats, things like that.
And there are a lot of those people out there.
But the thing is, regulation isn't going to help you with that one, right? So, and I think a lot of times what we keep, I feel the conversation gets lost when we get to regulation, right? Because if you think about it, regulation will help in places where we are actually trying to put an AI supply chain in a way where people across that supply chain can figure out what is coming to them, what they can build up on, what is intended versus unintended. So if you actually look at, for example, the EU AI Act, right? It's actually interesting because what it's actually talking about is, okay, there are specific usages that are not allowed, right? So there's the use part of it that says, these are prohibited usages, these are high-risk usages, and these are low-risk usages, right? And this is how we're going to regulate them. The requirements for these different usages look different, right? In some places, all you need is transparency in the AI supply chain. In other, you actually have to do, audits and make it clear what type of safety work has been done, what type of red teaming, things like that, right? All of that makes sense to build an AI supply chain where it enables all of that innovation and people to build on top of each other, which is actually what happens in the AI supply chain, in a way that people are informed and aware of these unintended risks. That, I don't see how that openness is a great thing, transparency is a great thing, being able to do all of that makes sense, adding provenance to data that gets generated by these models, right? So that you know whether this is, real or fake and all of these things. All of that responsibility and regulation makes a lot of sense. It's not gonna save you from the bad actors.
Well, but why not? I mean, because if major if, we had a functioning Congress and they were to pass a law tomorrow that the president signed into law, requiring provenance of data guidelines to be implemented immediately, requiring social video platforms to implement certain systems and have a lag between when a video is uploaded and it goes live, et cetera, we could, in theory, radically mitigate the risk to American democracy, for example. So is that something that we should be seriously talking about right now, given the stakes that are at hand?
Yeah, and that is happening. I mean, that happening as in that's part of where the regulation is headed, right?
Right, but we're not there.
But we're not going to be able to turn it on a dime, is what I'm saying. So there will always be a need to look at these, in ways that you're able to detect. For example, let's talk about deepfakes specifically, right? Because I think deepfakes, to me, I hear all of these stories about how robots will destroy the world and all of the Hollywood narratives. I think the most likely thing to happen is that when people start to mistrust everything that they see and they don't know what's real and what's not, that's what worries me the most, right? Because then you can manipulate people to do anything. You don't need to have robots blow up the world. You can make people do that.
Propaganda is a powerful drug.
Exactly. So to me, this notion of somehow overnight transitioning from everything has the right provenance, right? And every data that doesn't have provenance assumes that nobody's going to look at, that's not going to happen, right? So you have to invest quite a bit into fixing the issue of detecting these systems, right? Detecting deepfakes, looking in every possible way that you can look at different modalities of that data and say, okay, the likelihood that this is actually deepfake. So you need detection, not just provenance, to get you to bridge that gap towards full provenance.
Okay, so Alex, should Meta and YouTube and TikTok and Snap be investing literally probably the billions required right now to protect us? Is that the answer?
I mean, I think so. But I think that the issue, there's a few issues. I like the AI supply chain idea from Lama. I think that that's a good one. But one of the fundamental issues with this is that it is a very difficult technical problem to be able to properly mitigate all of the potential AI-generated content that's out there. And it's not clear exactly what technical bet you make in terms of how do you wholesale prevent any of this content from being able to show up on your sites. And so I think that there's a very real technical challenge with deepfakes that is maybe at the heart of all of it, which to me lends to a question of should we be funding a lot more research in this area? And I think that this is one of maybe the challenges, which is that the leading AI labs, they're incentivized very much so to build incredible new capabilities. But there's a lot of very important technical work and technical research that's be done in areas that are not building cooler capabilities, but are in these areas like interpretability or deepfake detection or being able to properly defang some of these models so that you can't generate deepfakes in certain areas and all these sorts of areas. Broadly speaking, scalable alignment and research in that direction is not something that's sufficiently funded today. So I think one of the areas that, and this is more on the grant funding process and NSF side, but is how do we fund more research in these areas so that we can actually not solve it? I think the large platforms can invest into trying to solve this problem. I think it looks a lot more like brute force in the interim, while we don't have the proper technical solutions.
And does that funding come from government, or does that come from the private sector?
Well, I think it's a mix of both. I mean, I think in the interim, the brute force solutions, I think the private sector probably needs to fund some of those. I think the long-term research direction, I think probably needs to be a mix of both.
Okay, so Lama, I hear Alex, I'm going to put words in his mouth, calling for billions of dollars in investment from the social video platforms to protect us, and probably an order of magnitude more from private and public to dive in on research. Is that how we get to the right answers here?
I think you absolutely need that. And I think there is a question I mean, to me, one of the interesting questions about that is the responsibility of the platforms that are serving that content, right? I mean, today, that responsibility does not lie with those platforms. And I think this is a place where you can actually make a big difference if there is liability of the content that's being provided, right? And then the incentives for driving a lot of the innovation, and yeah, I totally agree with Alex, right? I mean, that's a very hot research area today. It's not like these things are solved, but there's a lot of progress in this space. It's actually an area that we're investing in quite a bit in terms of research. But, you know, that you have to follow the incentive structure, right? By separating that liability and saying, okay, well, that looks different because it's a social media platform, right? That's not going to solve the problem. So I think this is where I feel like, yes, there's investment by private companies. There should be content regulation, right? There should be liability when you actually are not, when you're serving that content and the impact of serving that content. And I think that will probably unlock a really interesting innovation there because the incentive structures change.
So I'm a born optimist. I can see all of the AI dystopian scenarios playing out, and I lean into the ones that are more encouraging. As we bring the conversation to a close, I want to fast forward 1 year. I want you to imagine that we are back here. We've been invited back to the Intel Vision Summit for this conversation, and we're looking back on the past year, and something great has happened because of AI. AI has been a conditioned precedent for something great to happen. What do you think we're looking at a year from now? We're going, wow, that's incredible.
In a year from now?
If you want me to give you 2 years, I'll give you 2 years.
I mean, I'm actually quite, like for me, I think if we make roadways into climate change and material discovery, those are two areas that I think, AI can really transform the way we actually do this work. And if we're able to make any dent there, that would have a huge impact on society. I think, unfortunately, knowing how governments run, the regulatory side and where that might change fundamentally in terms of the responsible AI piece of that puzzle, I think that will take longer, just because of how long government takes.
Right. I mean, we could put effectively a doctor in the pocket of billions of people around the world who don't have access to high quality medical care tomorrow if we loosen some of that regulation. Yeah. Alex, what's your answer to that question?
I think similarly. I mean, a lot of areas that AI will be helpful in are sort of, there's great wins, but also there's lots of questions. And I think we've been talking about many of these questions over the course of today's conversation. To me, progress in pharmaceuticals in particular is an area where I think we'll see very rapid progress. I've spent a lot of time there just personally because it's an area that I find very interesting. There's been incredible advancements in biological foundation models, which look like, whether it's at the DNA or RNA level or at the protein level, look like they're going to enable huge amounts of innovation, lots of extensions of the sort of AlphaFold technologies that exist in the past. I think that unrelated to AI, but there's been huge advancements in synthetic biology. So we have much better versions of CRISPR now, including bridge RNA and other molecules which are able to which are much more powerful than CRISPR was, and all sorts of pretty huge building block innovations in sort of synthetic biology or pharmaceuticals or whatever you want to call it, which I think will lead to just a dramatic ability for us to help people who are sick. And I think that there's probably no nobler mission than that.
Phenomenal. Lama, Alex, thank you for joining us for this live taping of Masters of Scale. Appreciate you both.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.